Good morning. This is Kelly Johnson, and I'm back again today to talk about our journey to being brave. We are journeying together through Lent. This book, Being Brave, a 40-day journey to the life God dreams for you. And these videos are created as a part of our online study that we're doing together. And today this is our fourth video in the series, and we are talking about vulnerability. Vulnerability is, I say this every week, and I said it last week that this is my favorite, but I think that this topic is particularly meaningful for me because this is, of our BRAVE acronym, this is probably the area where God has done the most work in my life. And so I think this is such a central part of this story and this journey about being brave, but also in many ways sometimes the most ignored and not really what we think of when we think about being brave. So just as a review, we began our journey by looking at this little diagram where we talk about living in our comfort zone and feeling that call, that push, that whisper in our ear that invites us out into this life of fulfillment, meaning, dreams, service, adventure, what we sometimes call calling, our best life, the abundant life that Jesus is calling us to. And that how sometimes when we're in this comfort zone and we begin to move to this place, we experience some of these things, that what I call the saboteur zone, where we start to question, we start to struggle, we start to have doubts, we start to have fear. And we've talked about in our journey that we know that this is normal and that struggling is part of the journey, but that we can learn to struggle well, that we can learn to connect deeply with God in this place and deeply with one another. And so where we are in that process of understanding that a little bit more, we have been using our theme verse throughout our discussion, 2 Timothy 1:7, that says, "For we've not been given a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline." And we're trying to break that down. And in the book, there are 3 sections. We talk about that spirit of power, that spirit of love, and that spirit of self-discipline. And we've talked about in the videos this issue of being bold and resilient and authentic. And today we are looking again at vulnerability. We understand that the reason that we want to go more deeply into these topics is that building connection is a part of how we turn up the volume on God's voice and turn down the volume on that voice of that inner critic, that voice that keeps us stuck in our fears and our struggles. And so we want to turn up that volume on God's voice, and part of how that we do that is by connecting with one another. And we talked before last week about the things that build connection with one another, and particularly I'm talking, it's in any relationship, but particularly in terms of for us women, our women's friendships, and the ways that we build connection is through authenticity and vulnerability, and the things that are so much a part of our culture that block connection are competition, comparison, and perfectionism. So this issue of vulnerability, what does vulnerability mean? I love this quote from Jen Hatmaker's book. This is from the book For the Love, and I think this really encapsulates our journey of vulnerability. And this is what the quote says. It says, "When I present a fabricated version of myself, the self who knows all is ever certain, always stepping strong, we all lose because I cannot keep up with that lie and neither can you. If we could believe that we are deeply connected in the most fragile places, we could drop the games." And I think that's the invitation that this journey of vulnerability gives us. We talked in our video last week about authenticity, and that authenticity is about embracing that spacious place of God. And we looked at some scriptures around that. And that authenticity is learning to love, know, nurture, embrace our real, true, authentic selves, the self that God made, God's beloved, if you will. And vulnerability is about learning to share that authentic self with other people. And the word vulnerability, I want to talk a little bit about the definition of vulnerability. And we know that vulnerability is characterized by both risk and reward. The definition itself of vulnerability is capable of being wounded. So we know there's risk involved, right? There's uncertainty, there's emotional exposure, there is we talk about being vulnerable, and we talk about that there's an aspect of danger to it, right? We're putting ourselves out there in a way that exposes us to the possibility that we'll get hurt. Vulnerability is when we're bold enough to show up and allow ourselves to be seen in in that most authentic way that we've been talking about. You know, one of the pictures, I think a really good illustration of that vulnerability is, if you know how when a dog rolls over on its back and it exposes its tummy, you know, it wants to have its tummy petted. We know that out in nature, animals don't expose their bellies unless they feel completely safe, because that is their point of vulnerability. That is their point of greatest risk and exposure. And we know that our pets, you know, when they roll over and allow their tummy to be seen, that they trust us, that they feel safe in that environment. And because otherwise that's putting themselves in danger of being wounded. Vulnerability, one thing that it's important is to characterize the distinction that vulnerability is not letting it all hang out. One risk of vulnerability is that we're not smart and safe about where we are vulnerable. Vulnerability requires boundaries, and it requires trust. You know, telling all our business to every single stranger we meet is not healthy vulnerability, and that's what we're looking at, right? It's not oversharing. It's finding those people in our life who have earned the right to be trusted, or who at least have given us the indication that it's worth taking the risk to be vulnerable with. You know, one of the most beautiful examples I've seen of vulnerability recently was a few weeks ago when I was working the hypothermia shelter at my church. In our community, during the winter months, the different faith communities open up the church for a week at a time and offer that space for people to come and spend the night and get a hot meal and all of that. And my church, Flourish United Methodist, hosted the hypothermia shelter. I guess it was 3 weeks ago. And because, of course, my people, my friends from the Lamb Center are usually at the Lamb Center during the day, and then many of them spend the winter month, spend the night at the hypothermia shelters at the churches. So of course I wanted to be part of that, and so I was working in the showers. We have showers in our church, and so we were walking people back and forth from the main area where they were hanging out to the opportunity to use showers. And there was also going on at the same time a place where people were able to get foot care. And we had a couple of wonderful women who came in who were nurses who were doing foot care. And if you don't know, one of the highest risks for our homeless population is poor health in terms of their feet. You know, when you only have one pair of socks, when you're walking all day, many of our homeless brothers and sisters have really serious issues with their feet. And so foot care is a really important thing. And so these dear people were taking care of these folks. And this one gentleman came in, and I overheard this conversation, and he took off his shoes and socks, and the woman that was working with him, the nurse that was working with him, you know, was helping him, and he had some pretty serious issues. And so she did some things for him. She washed his feet. She cleaned up his nails. She did, you know, some different things for him. And then she walked through with him, you know, what he needed to do next, that he needed to see a doctor, that he needed to have, you know, some things taken care of in terms of his feet. And she gave him that, you know, who he should contact and how he should get there. And it was so sweet because I heard him say to her, I was really scared to ask for help. I was really scared to take off my shoes and socks for you. And I thought, and yet she was so kind and so loving that she made it a safe space for him to be courageous enough to risk, to take that. And it was just such a simple illustration of him being vulnerable enough to take off his shoes and socks and allow her to care for his feet. You know, it's just such a tender thing. And so I thought that was a beautiful example of asking for help, of her creating a safe and courageous space for him to be able to be vulnerable enough to connect. And there was clearly a connection between them, that this gentleman, and he had somewhat broken English, and yet he was able to get the care that he needed because he was able to be vulnerable. And they walked away with it was really a holy moment to witness. And one of the things that I often talk about when we talk about, this is something we go deeper in my one-day retreats that I do. And we make lists usually of what makes you feel vulnerable. When do you feel vulnerable? And some of the things that I often, I have my big notepad, we take notes, and it's always a slightly different list about what people find valuable, but there's always some common themes. And some of the things that people have given as examples of feeling vulnerable is asking for help. Anytime we ask for help, we feel vulnerable. Admitting we're wrong, saying we made a mistake, asking for forgiveness, sharing an idea that might be controversial, or maybe even just sharing an idea in a space where you haven't maybe been willing to speak up before, disagreeing with a popular opinion, showing up and sharing your art in a public way. So maybe that getting on a stage, or painting a picture and putting it out there. Every single time I hit publish on my blog, that feels very vulnerable to me. Asking for a raise, having a difficult conversation with someone who you need to confront and have a tough conversation with. Trying on a bathing suit. Oh my gosh, ladies, we always feel like, there's so much vulnerability around body issues for many of us. So those are some of the examples of places and spaces where we feel vulnerable. I think about some of the bravest things, and I've described it in the book, or friends of mine who've gone through serious health problems and have had to reach out and ask for help, and how that made them feel weak, I guess. And anytime that we feel exposed like that we feel like we're letting ourselves be seen, and putting ourselves out there for perhaps being evaluated or judged. Speaking in front of people is often a place where many people feel vulnerable. So you get the idea. We all feel vulnerable in a variety of different ways. So why do it, right? There's so much risk involved. Why put ourselves in the position to take those risks? And I think that the reason that we do that is because it's through vulnerability that we find the ways that we are alike. When we talk about that comparison and competition and perfectionism, that's when we notice and pay attention to the ways that we're different. Vulnerability shows us the ways that we're alike. And we talk about, and I'm going to read to you from the book in a minute, this power of the word "me too." When we share something vulnerably and somebody says, yeah, me too. And even just making our list in the retreats and hearing the way others feel vulnerable has been a powerful piece. And so we want to create, because we build connection through vulnerability, because we empower others through vulnerability. We want to build safe and courageous spaces in our community and in our relationships. And so how do we do that? How do we build safe, right? So that there's an element of this, my humanity, my story is going to be honored in this place, but also courageous in that we're willing to take a risk. And the verse that I want to share with you today that I think that gives us some clues is in James 5:13-16. And I love James. James is awesome. He's super bossy. He's super in your business. And I've just always really enjoyed the book of James. But I'm going to read this to you in the Message translation. This is, again, James 5:13-16. And it says, "Are you hurting? Pray. Do you feel great? Sing. Are you sick? Call the church leaders together to pray and anoint you with oil in the name of the Master. Believing prayer will heal you, and Jesus will put you on your feet. And if you've sinned, you'll be forgiven, healed inside and out. Make this your common practice. Confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you can live together whole and healed. The prayer of a person living right with God is something powerful to be reckoned with. Vulnerability, like what James is describing in this picture of community that he paints in these verses, reminds us that we need God and that we need each other. We were made for vulnerability. You know, Jesus actually modeled and honored vulnerability. One of my favorite stories, when I was digging around, I was looking for a story about a Bible character who exhibited vulnerability. I was so surprised that the story that really grabbed me and that I felt like was the most meaningful was the story of Jesus being vulnerable. You know, if you remember when he went into the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he died, and he was praying and pouring out himself to God. He was making himself vulnerable to God. He was like, I don't want to drink this cup. I know what you want me to do, but I really don't want to do it. If there's any other way, I want to go a different path. And he was pouring out his heart to God. And it says that he was distressed. I mean, the words in all the biblical descriptions of it were very strong about how upset he was. But not only did he reach out to his Father, to his Holy Father, he invited his friends to go with him. He asked his 3 closest friends to be there with him, to stand watch, to be by his side. And he shared with them the level of his distress. He shared with them how much he was hurting, how much he was suffering. And he said, I need you to be here with me. So Jesus both modeled vulnerability and honored vulnerability. The story where he honored vulnerability, I love, is when he talks about, when we hear the story of the woman who came and threw herself at his feet and cried, wept, anointed his feet with oil, and wept and dried his feet with her hair, you know, and all these disciples are like, man, she is not a lady you should be hanging out with. You shouldn't be associating with her. And Jesus said, no, do not take this from her. Her tears, her whispered I love yous, her whispered thank yous, her tears, her emotion, right, honored him. And he said, no, you back away. And he then gave honor to her too. You know, our emotions, tears is another place. I hate it when I cry in front of somebody else, right? That always makes me feel really vulnerable. But strong emotion can be another aspect of vulnerable. So how do we build that? You know, we read those verses from James. How do we build that culture of healthy vulnerability and build a safe and courageous space? And I pulled 3 things from there that I think are really key. And that's this. The first is, I wrote them down for you. How do we build a safe and courageous space? Go first. Be the one to break that barrier. You know how sometimes you sit in groups of people and everybody's staying really surface and everybody is kind of, you know, making small talk. I love that person, and I'm trying more and more to be that person who goes deeper first, who shares something, you know, who asks a deeper question, who wants to get below that surface and start talking about things that really matter. You know, going first might be when a friend, you know, run into a friend at you know, in the halls at the school or at your workplace or at church, and says, hey, how are you doing? And that time that you say, you know, on a day that things are really hard, that you say, you know what, things are really tough right now. I really could use your prayers. And you don't put on that mask of, oh, I've got it all together, or do the, oh, we're so busy, you know. But leave your mask at home. Be the first one to take that risk of vulnerability. And here's the thing, vulnerability is contagious, right? You know, when one person goes there, it gives permission for other people to be more vulnerable. And again, that sense of connection, that sense of, you know, others are like me, others struggle like me. I'm not the only one. That's such an important thing. The second thing is to embrace messy. You know, it talks about in that verse in James about confessing your sins to each other and praying for each other so that we can be whole and healed. You know, when we make it safe for people to confess the spaces where they're messy, and then we don't try to fix it, we don't try to talk them out of it, we don't try to say, oh, no, you're not. but we allow them to lay that down in our feet, and we say, you know, that's really hard. Thank you for sharing that with me. That we express empathy by showing someone that we heard them and that we're not so uncomfortable with this difficult topic that we need to sweep it away. You know, I think many of us, I've sat in small groups of women for years, and I think one of our tendencies is when someone shares something vulnerable, or they talk about a mistake they've made or something hard they're going through, we immediately either, one, try to fix it. You know, we try to give them solutions, give them advice, all the ways they can make, fix it, and because we're uncomfortable with that difficult feeling. Or we say, oh, no, you're not. You're a great mom. When they're sharing, I messed up this morning, man. I just screamed at my kids. I did not show up in the way that I wanted to show up in my family. I was not living consistent with my values. And we immediately let them off the hook and tell them all the reasons why they're wrong. That's not supportive either. And so one of the things that I really try to do in my retreats is embrace messy, is set up a community, a space that says, we're not going to try to fix each other. We're going to listen. We're going to be with each other and not and embrace messy. And the third thing that for me, it really builds a safe and courageous space is to hold hands and pray. I talk about there's a place in a few weeks where I talk about a situation at the Lamb Center and how we pray together numerous times a day. And I find that the people that I'm closest to in my life are the people who I can ask for prayer, who can ask me for prayer, who I can say, hey, you know what? Life is tough. I don't need you to solve this for me, but what I need for you to do is pray for me. And those are my truth tellers too. Those people who I can say, hey, I need you to pray for me. One of the examples that I give is that I have a good friend who was part of my prayer ladies, my prayer warriors. And I was saying, oh, I'm so nervous. I have to get up and talk in front of these people and, whatever. And, everybody was like, oh, I'll pray for you. And she said, you know what? Let me give you some feedback. It sounds like you're making this about you. And I know that's not your heart. Your heart is you want to serve those people you're speaking to. You want to serve them. You want to love them. You want to hear them. You want to be with them. Focus on them. That's where your heart is. And I thought, because of the fact that we have been vulnerable together, because we have walked together, that was a safe and courageous space for her, not only to say she could pray for me, but she could also say, hey, you're better than that. Step up. Be the courageous, bold, brave person that I know you to be. And that's just so, so key for me to have those things in my life. So go first. Be the one to be vulnerable, to share on a deeper level first. Embrace messy. Don't try to fix each other. It's a safe and courageous space when we can just be in that place of brokenness and love each other and talk about how our common struggles, and hold hands and pray. Find those people in your life that you can ask to pray for you and that you can pray for. I want to read to you something that you'll read in the coming week about the power of Me Too. And I wrote this originally after our first Being Brave retreat. And I think one of the things that is really has been powerful for me is how this word Me Too that I wrote about several years has now become, a whole movement, a hashtag Me Too. And the power is the same, right? It's finding that other people have experienced the same things that you have and have come alongside you, and you don't feel alone. You feel empowered when others say Me Too. So let me, in closing, because we need to wrap this up, read this to you. And this is day 24. There is healing magic in the words Me Too. We yearn for connection. We are wired for belonging. We want to know we're not traveling this path alone. Right from the beginning, God spoke these words: "It is not good for a man to be alone," and ordained our hunger for community. We need each other. Yet at the same time, we hide from each other. We push each other away in the spaces we need each other most. The nagging voice of our inner critic whispers these words: "You have nothing meaningful to offer. You aren't as good as her. You aren't as smart as that one. You are not enough. If they really knew you, they wouldn't love you." So we pretend, we wear our shiny happy masks and insist we're just fine. We adamantly declare how very busy we are as our proof of worthiness. We compare and compete, hoping to catch up and earn entrance to the imaginary club for which there are no actual members. Club perfect. We are convinced we just need to try harder so we won't be the only one on the outside looking in. But perhaps in our loneliness, we begin to experiment. We go first, right? We find a few people with whom we drop the act momentarily. We take a few risks and we test the waters. We admit our struggles. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing it all wrong. Sometimes I wonder if God is even listening to my prayers. Sometimes being a parent or a child or a spouse or a friend is really, really hard. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get over my bad habit of. Sometimes I feel like a total failure. And then we hear those magical, beautiful, life-giving words. Me too. We find we're not alone after all. We realize we are not the only one who wonders or the only one who doubts. We recognize ourselves in the stories others share, and we offer our own gift of Me Too. We discover that our inner critics speak a similar language, and we begin to suspect it is a language of lies. Perhaps, instead, the opposite is true. I am not the only one who struggles. I do have something to offer. I'm not the only one who's ever had that experience. We are all imperfect, growing, learning, and changing. We are stronger when we stand together. I showed up, I allowed my authentic self to be seen, and they loved me anyway. Most of us don't need others to fix our struggles, our worries, our doubts, or our fears. We don't need advice, platitudes, or solutions. Often we already know the answers or the path to find them. We simply need to know we are not alone in our struggles. We want to know we have been seen. We need to hear, me too. We need one another. Take a risk. Let down your guard and speak your truth. Show up and let yourself be seen. Offer the gift of Me Too to your fellow strugglers and take the hand of your brave Savior who leads the way back home. All right, guys, go out there, be brave, and build connection. Show up as your authentic self and be vulnerable. Go first, embrace messy, hold hands and pray. Love you guys. See you next time. Bye.